Welcome here in the Dachau concentration camp memorial site. I will talk to you today about clothes and shoes of the prisoners. You see here prisoners with sewing machines. Prisoners had to do forced work from the very beginning, also in tailorings. The big tailoring was inside the area of the SS, and they produced only military items for the SS soldiers. The soldiers could buy the wear there at the tailoring. And in the same building, you see here shirts and metal signs. In the same building had been the Dachau trials after the liberation of the camp. In a smaller experimental tailory were produced also shoes and clothes for prisoners. You see here a map. You see here, my colleague will show you on the right hand, this building it was broken down after the liberation. You see now trees and a hill. And in that building was the production of tailoring items and of shoes. On the other hand, on the left hand, had been a deposit for the clothes. And this small experimental tailoring was sold to the DAW, Deutsche Ausrüstungswerke, German supply companies in 1939 from the General SS, and it was sold to the Texlet, the textile company of the SS, in 1940. And from 1940 on, they produced the clothes of the prisoners in Ravensbrück in the women concentration camp. At the beginning, you see here a picture of the deposit room, there on the right hand. In that, we don't know too much about that small tailory, but we hear from two names. At first from Sturmführer Felix Sturm, and from Gustav Binder. Gustav Binder at the same time made his ground course for the service in concentration camps, and both were tailors. Both did know what they did. And what do we know about the small company? They also took orders from fashion companies like Betzart. Betzart produced suits for men. They drove in the fabrics. The prisoners cut it very cheap, and they brought it out to produce the rest. One driver of the company, Betzart, drove in cigarettes for the prisoners, and he drove out letters without being controlled and censored. One prisoner was angry because he felt not well treated, and he denunciated him. And there was an investigation, so we heard the name. So, please follow us. Here you see the roll call square, and over there is a plan and an air picture of the concentration camp area, taken short before the liberation on April 20, 1945. But which clothes prisoners wear? At the first time, you see here, they took their private clothes, nothing else. This is a picture taken in April 1933. And we have also sources by example, from Julius Zervas. He wrote under the name Walter Hornung. The picture did not look military at all, even though the head of the company marched at a brisk pace. The diversity of the civilian suits gave the impression that a detachment of recently enlisted recruits was marching here. So he wrote about the new prisoners in April 1933. In other camps, the situation was much more precarious, like in the Moor camp of Esterwegen. The Esterwegers look terrible. They have no work clothes yet. They have to go into the bog in their civilian suits. They move along the troop of neglected robbers, burst shoes, torn trousers, punctured elbows, everything full of mud and dirt. A desolate horde. Josef Reuth, a member of the German Labour Party, came here in 1933, and he saw one scene as the first such called social prisoners came here, prisoners who came out of working houses or other social institutions. And he wrote about that. In order to replenish the stock, about 100 men from the Repdorf workhouse came into the camp in the late summer 1933. Other criminals were also brought in to maintain stock of labor for many projects that had been started. These were all well dressed because they were paid, albeit very little. But for the work in Repdorf, they might have been polished a few days on the roll call square, crawling around to the square in their good suits until they got finally a job, a work by anyone. That means they dehumiliated them by destroying their own clothes. From July 1933 on, the prisoners got uniforms. The uniforms were monochrome, you see here, and made of Loden fabrics. The Loden fabric was given from a company in Munich from Lodenfrei, and the tailors in the group of the prisoners sewed set uniforms. There we have a better picture. You see monochrome. And here we have another one that is one of the last one, monochrome. In 1938, when the new camp has been built. It looks proper. It is a propaganda picture. We listen to a text from a few lines from Alfred Hübsch, who had been a prisoner here, and he wrote, "We tore the strong streets from cement sacks and used them to mend our clothes in the evening, so that wind and cold could not penetrate. We put straw in our shoes and clogs, which most of us wear, to soften the penetrating cold. The strong cement paper sacks served to protect us from the rain because we had to take off the coats." Well, the coats were made out of cellulose and they had to be worn when it has been cold, and the prisoners had to work in the rain without those coats. You have to imagine that coats in monochrome. The wild park, well, it was that area in the north of the camp. The force commander of Dachau, Hans Loritz, let build the prisoners a wild park with a cabin, with a lake, to relax from the hard day of a concentration camp commander. Well, the prisoners got pajama uniforms. The pajama uniforms you know from movies, you know from also from documentaries. From April 1938 on, here in Dachau, the first had been produced, and the first of that suits had been given to the prisoners. And the prisoners had to wear different kinds of triangles. See, red triangles for such called political prisoners that were also priests, not only members of political parties. The green one for the such called professional criminals. That was an item typical of the ration of the folkish ideology. And also the homosexuals had to wear pink one, and the such called asocials had to wear the black triangles. And all Jewish prisoners had to wear a second one, a yellow one, as you see here. And we have pictures from prisoners from Dachau. It was Sinti and Roma in Buchenwald, after they had been arrived. They were here red triangles for the political prisoner. This was unusual for the such-called so-called Zigeuner, and they were upward the number and down beyond the triangle. 2 weeks later, they got the uniforms in Buchenwald. Which kind of clothes prisoners wear? Well, women wear monochrome uniforms until 1942. From 1942 to 1943, they changed to the striped uniforms. We have a drawing made by Violette Lecoq. She made a lot of pictures in Ravensbrück, and those drawings from her, you see the women shaved after the arrival, were documentaries for the trials against the SS men from Ravensbrück after the liberation. You see here, the clothes were really different. We have that one here, with 2 rows of bottoms, and we have here another one, a summer uniform. Oops. From Sachsenhausen. It was not made of cellulose, it was made of cotton. And you see the arrangement of the triangle, and the number was different to Dachau. Okay, how the arrival has been here. Let's go into the shunt room. Here you see the economic building, seen from the inside. You see here in the middle there has been the kitchen of the concentration camp. Beyond the monumental there had been the laundry, and on the other hand you see that row at the eastern side, it had been the deposit of the prisoners' clothes. There had to work 200 tailors, around 200 shoemakers, and 200 repairmen for socks, because there was a lack on socks all the time. We pass now the former rooms of the metal workshop and of the electrical workshop. We pass away which passed the prisoners from 1938 on. They came through that door. They came in that room. That was the thrust room, the Schubraum. It was parted in two parts. Here were the vitrinas, where you see the vitrinas, were standing heavy writing desks. On the other hand of the writing desks had been standing SS men and prisoners who worked as writers for the SS. The newcomers came in, they were beaten, there was a shouting and screaming all the time. They had to line up, they had to go in front. And then they had to give, in 1940, everything they had, and then they had to disrobe. All their clothes were taken in paper bags and were deposited in the rooms here and in the attic. And after that position, they were standing nude here, they were sent over to the prisoners' bath. Before they got a such called prisoners' personal effect card for their own property. And we have here such a card from an officer, a Polish officer, who came from the Oflag of officers' prisoners' camp from Murnau. Murnau is my home place. And, well, the Gestapo has, you see the Oflag in 1945. One of the officers, Paul Rachfal, the Gestapo made a research against him in his Polish home in Posen, and in July 1943 he was arrested in Murnau. He was brought to the concentration camp of Dachau, and here he had to give everything. Also his good military boots. See here the things he gave. And as later the war goes on, in 1944, 1945, those personal effect card had only few marks. And 2 months later, he made an application to the commander of the prisoners' camp to change his half shoes he had been given from the camp against his military boots. But, well, how did he have chances? Well, I don't know. In principle, it was I show you. That was the application. Was it possible to change? There were certificates for wearing even the own leather shoes. And a doctor had to give. You see the topic name, Alois Bach. He was a German communist, and he was, in the eyes of the Nazis, a so-called Aryan. And he was sentenced for 2 years prison in 1938 because of high treachery. After his liberation from jail, he was arrested again by the SS, and he was brought here in the concentration camp. And he was allowed to wear his own shoes, because he had inlets. And here we have a picture from Alois Bach. Were the only the so-called Aryans the one who had chances to get back their shoes. Let's have a look. We have here Johann Duratsky. He was a Polish one, a less worse man as the Nazis saw that, and he got the right to wear shoes. But he was a shoemaker, he was standing at the source, and he has connections. So two things happened to get better shoes. It were racial superiority, so-called, and it was still corruption. There you see things which the prisoners had given. It were material things which were hidden deposited by the SS men for the case of a release. Before the breakout of World War II, releases often happened. By example, Adolf Hitler's 50th birthday on April 20, 1939. But after the breakout of World War II, there were rather no more releases. In that room, we have the different groups of prisoners, and example for that. And here, it was the prisoner's bath. Here you see one suit of a prisoner from Stanislav Vaclavic. He was a priest. You see, it was a winter suit with blue and gray steps. It was made of wooden cellulose, also the cap. And I want to have you a look on his pantene. He had to wear pantenes, wooden pantenes, nailed in a frame. The prisoners were, I have here a commercial sign from a shoe store in Leipzig, 1938. You see here at the top a Zweischnaller. It was a working shoe. This was a galoche. That was a closen shoe. That was the kind that the most prisoners, male prisoners, wear. It was a pantene, like you have seen here, and that was a Dutchman. Also, German people wear the shoes. They were much cheaper as leather shoes. They only costed 25% of a leather shoe. And here you see a Budapest shoe. Well, it is from any commercial newspaper to show you how it looks. And that is the same product from the Allach exhibition. That means they only had the wooden sole and they put it on with nails, any textiles to let the people work. We have here a statistics. The most male prisoners were in 1944 those half shoes, and you see the Zweischnaller were much smaller, and leather shoes were an excellent. Well, there was an exemption, but women. 50% of the male prisoners, female prisoners, did not wear shoes at all. There was one remark of Rosa Vetter. She was imprisoned in Ravensbrück. She was a Roman Catholic nun. the last thing everyone got was a pair of clogs, usually 2 pairs of old slippers. You had to get used to them and to learn to walk in them. I lost them several times at the beginning. From April 1, 1941 to April 1, 1942, as in the summer before, the prisoners in Ravensbrück had to walk barefoot. And it was different. It was really hard to get the real pair of shoes because they did not care about it. And so the prisoners could take 2 shoes with the right size, but 2 right shoes. Or 2 shoes, one in the right size and the other one in the wrong size. Primo Levi, an Italian Jew, he said the shoes were the beginning of the death, a Jewish Italian. And we have one man, this is a comic painting of Jean-Pierre Gautier, Mager. His grandfather has been a prisoner here in Dachau, and he painted the tragedy of the suffering of his grandfather. And here you see the giving out of shoes. Everything must happen in a hurry. You take your shoes, and if the shoes were not all right, the one had to look to get a shoe which was in the right size and which was also the missing left or right shoe. We have from Angelo Baccari from Italy. He wrote about that. In my case, it happened that I had 1 pair of clogs in quite good condition, but 2 right shoes and not the same size, possibly 1 in 38 and 1 in 40, so a little smaller than my size I wore as a civilian, 42. Maybe many other prisoners were less fortunate. They cried, those poor things. They were given children's wooden slippers of different size, as well as non-identical pairs that you couldn't even put the tops of your feet into. And if you have a look on the shoes, you see a picture from the SS, and you see those prisoners are wearing good shoes, obviously. But take care of the paintings and drawings. You see here, the prisoners were wearing the pantines. They helped their friend who was suffering from hunger. And here we have, from the archive, a Zweischnaller in a good condition. The working shoe. We have another one, pair of Zweischnaller. That one, you see, was made of a different kind of leather. It was made of pig's leather. They were very, very soft. And the sole was made of wood. And we have a picture here. You see that picture from Hans Quäks coming back from the plantage. Look at the shoes of the man who was helping his friend, his comrade. And let's have a look on one of the prisoners, one of the youngest prisoners after the liberation. Take a look at his feet. He was 10 or 11 years old, and he wore women's shoes. That was the truth. Here we have a picture of Siegmund Raznyevsky. He was one of the young Polish prisoners who came here in 1940, and he worked after he had worked on the plantage. It was a very, very hard job to do. He worked in the shoemakers, workshop for a short time before he came to Prezifix. Prezifix was a company of the SS for the production of screws, where he worked as a writer. In the time before, he had to produce Dutchman wooden shoes for his comrades. And there was another man, his name was Hermann Enzmann. He came from Bohemia, from the Sudetenland, and he was a labor man. He was arrested here for 4 weeks, and he was the grandfather of the owner of our cantina here in the memorial site. Here, let's have a look on the production. The production of clothes was brought in 1940 from Dachau to Ravensbrück, to the women's concentration camp. And the conditions were very hard. We have sources from women who worked there. And here we have a picture of the room, of the sewing room in Ravensbrück. The production of the clothes for the prisoners was done from 1940 there in Ravensbrück and in a few free companies. And we have here the conditions were horrible. At once, the weaving had to be done by the women. But the women all were busy in manual looms, but the production of fabrics was not enough. So the production in the tailoring stopped because they could not work. They had not enough fabric. And the women were beaten all the times. We have at first a report from Lili Unden from Luxembourg. Whoever entered the large hall the first time where 600 prisoners worked at the insertion tables for blanks, the manual work and control tables at the 13 sliding belts, each with 26 sewing machines, the various special and head punching machines, and the steam ironic machine felt transported to the hell as an insane asylum. Apart from the noise of the machines, of the stifling hot air that took our breath away, you could hear the roar of the SS men, guards at every tour, and witnessed an incredible scenes of beatings. The same report came from Margarete Buber-Neumann, who had been before in the Soviet Union in a gulag, who came to Germany and was arrested in the concentration camp in Ravensbrück. She wrote about the most feared beast in tailoring one was Unterscharführer Binder. He usually went out hunting before midnight. Suddenly, a rattling noise droned out with a beastly roar. For a moment, the machine stopped, and all women looked up in horror. Binder stood in front of his victim, who wasn't working fast enough, who had sewn a crooked seam, or that he simply hated out of any reason. He shouted, "Hö, hö." His face turned red, his eyes bulged, and he knew about what was going on to happen. He grabbed the woman by the hair, pushed her down in the sewing machine, yanked her up again, and beated her. The beating was rolling on the floor with blood pouring out of their nose. It was horrible. And in that atmosphere, the production could not be profitable, could not be enough. In 1943, the production went down. Here you see the rows, the lines of the blue line is the line of the prisoners' clothes, and they could rather produce nothing anymore, and prisoners got other clothes. At first, from the Polish and Slavian prisoners and Russian prisoners, their clothes became automatically property of the concentration camp. That means if they had died, they gave their clothes to other prisoners. And we have orders here from 1941. We have given the allowance to the prisoners to ask at home for warm clothes. And in 1942, May 27, it is forbidden, because of the lack of socks, to wear socks in the summer. And from 1943, February 9, in according with the chief of Amtsgruppe B, will be ordered that clothes in the concentration camp, which was brought from Russian or from Polish prisoners, will become property of the concentration camp. This was an act of robbery. And on November 7, 1944, the deposit in paper bags is no more possible. So also the clothes from such called Aryan prisoners was given to other prisoners. If those prisoners should be released, the release has to wait as long as clothes could be found for those persons. The money had to pay the financial cash. That means they used other clothes. And here we have a prisoner from a picture from the Schur house, from the roll call square. And you see here on the corner, you see prisoners with non-striped uniforms. Those uniforms were clothes of the victims of the Holocaust, which were brought from the extermination camps like Auschwitz to the other concentration camps to be controlled by the tailors for jewelries or money. And then those clothes were given to the other prisoners. You see here that picture which was taken after the liberation. And we have pictures from prisoners who wore their clothes. Ivan Holovan was one of the last prisoners. He was taken in custody in April 1945, and he wore his old uniform. He visited the concentration camp memorial site in 1997, and then he went in a toilet cabin. He undressed his clothes, he closed a suit, and he took that uniform into a trash can together with some Red Army medals. The other one, you see that uniform? The other one was a woman. Her name was Margita Horakova. She came from Slovakia. She has been brought to Auschwitz. And from Auschwitz, she had been brought to Dachau, to a satellite camp in Augsburg, to the Michelwerke. And there she got that dress from an unknown murdered women in Auschwitz. And she had to sew on the triangle in red and the yellow stripe for being a Jewish prisoner and her number. We have that in detail. On the corner we enter now has been the laundry. They had a laundry in Dachau from beginning. In the last days, we know from Giovanni Melodia that here clothes were cleaned, SS uniforms. Prisoners' uniforms were cleaned all 4 weeks, but the SS men also cleaned here things like carpets. But in general, the SS gave also the uniforms of the prisoners outside to clean it in civil commercial laundries. Like we have a report here from Saalfeld. The camp Lora was a satellite camp of the concentration camp in Buchenwald. And the SS men brought the clothes of the prisoners to Saalfeld to one laundry. And we have a report from one of the workers. The prisoners' clothes were cleaned at the Emil Klunker laundry in Saalfeld. The staff could at least guess that Laura was proceeded with an extreme brutality. In the eyewitnesses' account of an employee, it says the clothes, larger piles with about 100 pieces per delivery, were brought in a baggage cart. Often the things were bloody. 2 SS men accompanied the transport and uncleaned themselves. When the clothes arrived from Laura, everyone was plagued with fleas and other vermin. The clothes were treated against the vermin with gas. Well, after the liberation, here we see the room which shows the pictures from the liberation, and ordinary here a movie ran about the liberation of the prisoners. You see here pictures, and over there has been that building has been the deposit of the prisoners' suits, where the tailors, shoemakers, and repairmen for socks had been working. And the leader of the concentration deposit, his name was Anton Weber, and he was accused. Anton Weber was accused because he had been, they told, he had been lazy and fat, but very brutal. By example, one thing was that he forced one tailor to sew a jacket which was full of fleas and full of lice. The man tried not to clean it because he was afraid to be infected with typhus, but he forced him. And the others, his colleagues, saw that in the moment the jacket was sewed, lice were running around on the sewing machine. And he was very brutal against, here we have a picture, he was very brutal against prisoners who tried to get a shirt. 2 Russian prisoners tried to get shirts. He found them and he beaded them blue and green, those prisoners told the lawyer. He was sentenced to 18 years of prison. He tried to get pardon 1 year later, but he did not get any pardon. His further fame we don't know. It is unknown to us. In 19th, we have now the view on the roll call square. In the year 1995, the concentration camp memorial site celebrated its 15th year of liberation. And a lot of former prisoners came in their old suits or in new suited striped uniforms. Theodor Eicke, the first commander of the concentration camp, he tried to make that striped uniforms in 1938 as a sign of discrimination. For him, only 3 kinds of people existed. The one with no criminal report, then people with criminal report, and prisoners of concentration camps. But he did not reach discrimination. In 1995, those clauses became a sign of resistance, became a sign of an anti-fascistic mind. I want to say thank you to you, and maybe you have questions. I will ask. Thank you.